The smell of lemon polish and the clink of crystal announced a place that had perfected polite exclusion. Soft light spilled over marble, candle flames trembled in polished sconces, and a pianist lifted a phrase as if the music itself kept the crowd in its correct seats. Tanya Williams smoothed her dress at the doorway, palms warm on the leather of the reservation confirmation in her pocket. Her sons, Malik and Jaden, leaned a little closer. This was supposed to be a night they would remember for good reasons. It was her 40th, a quiet celebration of the years she had kept the household and the small kitchen that had become theirs. She had booked 3 seats she had saved for a night that felt like belonging. They handed her a menu as if the restaurant had no memory of her reservation. The maitre d' moved with the practiced grace of someone who had learned how to say no with a smile. Behind him, a waiter's eyes flicked toward the sons. There was a tiny rearrangement of footsteps, a shielding of space. The smiles around the room were perfectly calibrated to let them know where they belonged. A whisper slid past Tanya like dust. Tanya watched the man's mouth shape a line she had seen before in other rooms, an equation of risk and comfort where she and her boys did not fit. She felt Malik straighten his shoulders, trying to swallow a small protest. Jaden looked at her hand. He was 8. His fingers were still child-soft, but his eyes had a sudden adult stillness. She could have insisted. She could have made a scene loud enough to be heard across the polished floor. She thought of the looks that could follow, of a viral indignity, of her boys learning to carry shame like a second coat. She folded the reservation slip, closed her purse, and left. They didn't want us. She said nothing. She left. She let the echo of clinking glasses and the pianist's slow flourish follow them into the night. If you believe dignity matters, tap like. That silence in the doorway became a sound she carried. It landed in her chest like an accusation and a promise. At dawn, she was up in a kitchen that smelled of garlic and coffee, listing clients in a notebook with pencil stubs and a ruler. She started by cooking for the neighborhood church luncheon, hauling aluminum trays from a hatchback 2 streets over. She learned to invoice without flinching. She learned the rhythm of bookings. A deposit, a call to confirm, a polite thank you note that read the next day like a seed planted in well-tilled soil. Hours were carved out of exhaustion. While the city slept, Tanya practiced sauces and sauces practiced her patience. She memorized the cost per head of every plate she could plausibly serve to 50 people. She bought crates of lemons in bulk and taught Malik how to hold the sharpening steel. Jaden learned to fold napkins so their corners formed a small, fierce point. When a church fundraiser offered her a repeat, she said yes. When a wedding planner called for a tasting, she showed up with plates that looked like small celebrations and tasted like homecoming. Each satisfied fork was a tiny ledger entry toward the ledger that mattered: belief. Money came slowly, but it came. She took contracts from corporations that needed soul on a platter and delivered warmth wrapped in a silver cloche. She hired a line cook who had learned to brace against late nights, 2 part-time drivers who knew the city's shortcuts, and an assistant who could chase invoices down like a bloodhound. The kitchen spilled into a catering company, and the catering company spilled into opportunities that made the ledger pages thicker: a charity gala, a boutique hotel launch, a feature in a lifestyle magazine that titled the piece, "Small Kitchen's Big Vision." None of it felt like revenge. It felt like work. It felt like answering the humiliation with a ledger and a calendar, and a refusal to make someone else's rejection the center of her life. She framed a faded napkin from that night at Le Méridien and hung it in the small office above the pots. Malik and Jaden saw it as a relic, a thing that belonged to an earlier version of them, a version who had left without speaking. But the napkin sat like a map. They learned respect, not as a performance to win others, but as a standard they set for themselves. Years passed in the way that small businesses stretch the elastic of time. Invoices, deliveries, new plates, new hires, missteps, and recoveries. Tanya's company started to lease a shared commercial kitchen on a weekday and began to pick up weekend gigs for pop-ups. A local food critic, having tasted her braised short ribs, wrote a paragraph that found its way into an editorial calendar and then into a column shared on social media. The orders swelled. Her hands, once calloused merely by habit, bore the marks of sustained work. She hired an operations manager. People started calling her Madame Williams as if the city had finally given a title to the thing she had built. And then the sign appeared. La Méridien. For sale. It was not melodramatic. The building's brass plaque sagged slightly in the heat. The restaurant that had once folded them into an unwanted silence now sat in a for sale listing like a fossilized memory. Tanya drove by twice before she told Marcus. Marcus Williams, her husband, had been by her side through the long ledger years. He had helpfully run numbers when she asked, and kept the household practical. He'd folded napkins too, when his hands were less busy with his own job. He had an easy laugh and a seriousness that suited contracts and bank offices. They had always been a team, with Tanya the daily engine of the business. When he saw the listing, he looked at her with something like reverence and a pragmatic frown. "We can do it," Marcus said simply. He did not say it as bravado. He said it as one who had seen the math and trusted the woman who had made the math sing. There were meetings, spreadsheets, careful nights with calculators and cups of tea cooling beside a legal pad. Gossip circulated about the restaurant's fate. Some locals wondered whether the chef had burned out. Others speculated on the landlord's reasons. Tanya and Marcus toured the back of house on a gray Thursday. Old tile, a walk-in cooler that hummed like an old beast, and a dining room that smelled of polish and policy. They crawled through memories and crawled through the supply closets. Ed Russo, the outgoing owner, was polite and older than the memory of the night at the doorway. He remembered a reservation and apologized for a staff error with the modest, brittle way of someone who ran many rooms and had stopped seeing some patrons as faces. Negotiation is not a single scene. It is a string of afternoons. It is a count of change and patience. Tanya insisted on terms that would preserve the kitchen's authenticity and invest in a staff retraining program. Marcus handled the financing calls with a steadiness she liked. They structured the purchase so that Tanya's company would be the operational owner. Legally, Marcus agreed to be the public-facing signatory on the title for the first few months. The reason was practical and painful both. The couple's accountant explained that creditors in the building's neighborhood can be conservative about lending for minority and female-led ventures. Some banks and insurance companies had underwriting quirks that favored a familiar name on the paperwork. Tanya's name was on every contract that mattered, on every press clip and client note, but the initial steward of the deed would legally be Marcus. That decision stung, and it clarified everything. It was not erasure, it was strategy. Tanya would run the floor, design the menu, hire the staff, and train them. Marcus would sign his name where the city would read an easier story. Tanya did not like hiding, but she hated being blocked more. They closed the deal in a modest lawyer's office with pens that clicked like metronomes. Marcus signed, and the pen left a dark script that would be the headline the first time anyone checked property records. Tanya signed the operating agreement the same day. Her signature was smaller, but it bound the restaurant's new future to her name in practice if not in title. If the choice read like compromise, it also read like calculation. Marcus would be the visible owner at the reopening. The city would see a man in the doorway and assume a certain continuity of power. But Marcus would stand behind Tanya when the curtain rose. That had been agreed upon in a kitchen over takeout and in financial breakdowns with an accountant who did not flinch at reality. This strategy was a deliberate strike at systemic friction. They would use the script the city expected to write a different ending. Renovation kept them awake. Tanya drew new menus with her handwriting, selecting dishes that honored the slow comfort of what she had always cooked and the sharper contemporary techniques she'd admired at culinary schools. They rehired cooks and fired those who carried the old air of dismissal like an accent. Staff retraining was not about pointing fingers. It was about resetting expectations. Tanya insisted that every server spend a day in the line, plating, rushing, and understanding the exhaustion that came with the craft. If you can't respect the plate on your hand, you won't respect the person across the table, she told the team. They replaced the maitre d', who had been on duty the night she'd been turned away. The firing was clinical. Tanya had watched him from the doorway when the old owner explained the purchase, and she knew the look. Someone had to decide if that look would be permitted in a house they now owned. He left without a scene. The incoming staff were taught that excellence and dignity could walk together. The rebrand was subtle. They kept Lameridan's bones but softened the edges. Warm light replaced the clinical glow. The music had an openness that invited conversation rather than surveillance. Menus were written with a sentence about making room, not policing it. The kitchen had a chalkboard with the brief, blunt words, "Welcome, do better." Tanya signed her name beneath it, small and private. The grand reopening ribbon cutting invited the city quietly and widely. Invitations were sent to past clients, local journalists, and culinary influencers. A neighborhood church booked a table. A few faces from the first night, now older, not necessarily guilt-bent but present, were also invited. Tanya wanted the night to be full of those who were part of the story. She also wanted it to be ordinary enough that the food could speak. As guests arrived, the dining room buzzed with warmth. Crystal clinked, but now the clink was not armor. It was celebration. Plates came with stories stitched into sauces and gratitude written in side dishes. Malik, grown taller, moved through the dining room carrying water and wiping tables when asked. Jaden, who had learned to listen at a young age, sat in a corner with a notebook, watching faces more than food. Tanya paced the kitchen like a general whose troops could trust her voice. She checked a sauce, corrected a plating, lent a quick hand to a young server who looked like she needed it. Then he appeared. Daniel. No, the man who had been the maitre d' years before. The same thin smile, moving through the entrance like he had been invited in by habit, or perhaps by the RSVP on his phone. The room recognized him by the way his shoulders assumed the authority of a person used to refusing. He scanned the room. He scanned faces. His eyes met Malik's and held in a way that was more complicated than surprise. The man hesitated as if reading a script and finding the lines rearranged. Marcus stepped into the doorway. He did not stride. He walked. The room took the small inhalation it makes when someone new crosses the threshold. Marcus wore a suit that fit like a promise. He carried with him the quiet insurance of documents and legal signage. He carried the key that read owner in city registers. For a second, the room processed the headline this created. The owner was standing at the entrance, and then Marcus turned. He did not aim for a theatrical statement. He moved to the center of the dining room with easy assurance and took the microphone that had been intended for the evening's short remarks. "Good evening," he said, voice carrying without flourish. "Thank you for being here. When Tanya and I walked into this building 3 years ago, it wasn't just the floor that needed repair, it was the welcome. Tonight," he paused and looked directly at Tanya. "Tonight you are looking at the person who turned a single night of shame into thousands of meals that fed this city's gatherings. Tanya Williams did the work. Tanya taught our staff how to hold excellence and dignity at the same time. I signed the papers because that helped us secure this place. Tanya built this house." There was no theatrical claptrap. The applause was human and immediate. Malik and Jaden looked like two boys watching a law of gravity take place, the weight of their mother's labor lifting and landing where they could see it. Tanya felt something like relief, not only because the room acknowledged her, but because the story the city would tell now included her name in its verbs. The former maitre d', the man who embodied the cold refusal from their earlier night, had approached the edge of the dining room. He stood there, small against the flood of warmth. There would be no spectacle of humiliation. Marcus did not point him out. He did not gloat. He simply invited the man to meet Tanya, to let the record show that the person who had been excluded once was now asking the former refuser to do better. "Will you tell them your name?" Marcus asked, voice steady. The man blinked as if waking. He gave his name, his voice softer than before. No one shouted. Conversation resumed. The man sat, ordered with a tentative politeness, and when his food arrived he ate it the way people eat when they are in a new script, carefully with attention that had more to do with curiosity than with judgment. Tanya moved through the dining room afterward, her hand occasionally brushing a shoulder, answering a question about a dish, listening to a compliment that never turned itself into a coronation. The night was not about revenge. It was about re-education. Marcus's entrance had been a headline, yes, but the paragraph that followed, substance over spectacle, was all Tanya. The next morning, The city's food column called the reopening a lesson in quiet power. An interview came, then another. When the journalist asked, "Who is the face of this restaurant?" Marcus smiled and said, "If you want a face, see Tanya's hands." He did not take the spotlight. He reframed it. In staff meetings, Tanya told the story as a brief parable. She spoke of that reservation night as if it were a starting point, not a final verdict. She told her team that power was less about public vindication and more about refusing to let other people's limitations write your life. The new maitre d', someone who had been hired from within the community, took up the mantle not of judge, but of host. Training days included empathy sessions and practical exercises. Servers rotated with line cooks. Managers learned how to listen to complaints and how to coach rather than dismiss. The restaurant adopted a policy of inclusion that was not performative. It was practical. There were accountants and insurance renewals and nights that went wrong. The dishes overcooked, a delivery got lost, an illness struck a cook. But these were the growing pains of a place learning to be both excellent and accountable. Once, when a group of older patrons asked for a private table, Tanya offered a quiet smile and a choice. "We can seat you at the far corner where you can have the hush, or we can sit you in the center, where the sound feeds the heart. Which do you prefer?" People chose. They learned that the restaurant asked questions rather than assigning roles. Malik and Jaden watched their mother in a way that stitched into them a vocabulary beyond protest. They learned that power could be the daily accumulation of things, invoices paid on time, staff treated with dignity, an honest menu that cost what it needed to. They learned that the table you thought you had to beg for can be built, chair by chair. Years after the reopening, Tanya's catering arm had become a model for small businesses that started in spare bedrooms and grew into physical spaces. She mentored young entrepreneurs who needed more than a how-to. They needed the patience to treat their work like an apprenticeship rather than a lottery. She spoke at community centers about access to capital, about the ugly truth that sometimes paperwork determines who gets a chance, and about the ways you can meet that reality without surrendering your story. On one late afternoon, as she walked through the kitchen, Marcus found her looking at the chalkboard where her name had been written small and private. He slid his hand into hers without speaking. "You should know," he said after a minute. "How many people asked me that night to step forward because they trusted a man more than a woman on the paperwork. I felt like I was standing between you and a second indignity. It felt necessary." She squeezed his hand. "You did what we needed to do," she said. "We made the story work for us." There was gratitude in her voice, and there was no apology. The ledger of truth balanced, his legal name on the title, and her long, grinding labor behind every ticket. If anyone walked away from their story with a thirst for retribution, they would have been disappointed. The Williamses had chosen a different victory: to remake a table, to invite and sustain, to demonstrate competence so clearly that it became a language the city couldn't ignore. They had chosen to train minds, not humiliate bodies. One evening, months after the reopening, Tanya sat at the table with her sons and Marcus. Malik had a job at the restaurant now, and Jaden was studying hospitality management. They ate without fanfare, leftovers plated with care. Marcus reached across and tapped Tanya's hand. "Your name is on every menu we print," he said. "But not the deed," she answered. She was not defensive. "That doesn't matter to me." "It matters to our sons," Marcus replied gently. "They needed to see this room change and to see us in it, every way it took to get here." Tanya thought of the night at the doorway, the precise cold in the air, the way the pianist had filled the void that the room had left in them. She thought of the small ledger with pencil stubs, of the thousands of meals, of the way elements had combined, strategy, grit, the patience to choose where to fight and what to build. The hum of the restaurant pulsed around them like a satisfied heart. "This was our table," she said finally. "We didn't wait for permission." Marcus nodded. "We didn't just take a seat, we built the kitchen." There is a line that often surfaces in stories like this, that the world finally had to see what it had refused. But that is not the truest point. The truest point is smaller and more stubborn. The work changed the people who did it. The sons learned dignity by watching a mother who refused to make her worth contingent on somebody's smile. Patrons learned to be asked a question rather than assigned a place. Staff learned to hold the plate and the person with the same respect. On social media, people shared the story in different cuts. Some read it as a lesson in savvy strategy, others as proof that grit pays off. Tanya's favorite comment was a short note from a woman who had once been turned away from another place in the city. "My daughter and I ate there tonight," the message read. She folded the napkin differently. "Thank you." The couple did not make the practice of using Marcus's legal name as a shield into a habit once the initial friction of financing had passed. They had been candid in interviews. Marcus had been the signatory because the system works in odd ways. The paperwork did not reflect the sweat. They made that clear, again and again, because they wanted their sons and other young entrepreneurs to understand that fairness is sometimes negotiated in the margins of the market, and that telling the truth about those margins helps dismantle them. When the older maitre d' asked for a meeting months later, he did so with the admission you might expect from someone who had learned to see. He did not beg forgiveness. He asked for work, for a chance to be part of something he had not understood. Tanya, who had once left without making a scene, listened. She hired him in a role that required humility and patience. He was trained and eventually rose to be a mentor to new staff who came from his old neighborhoods. Redemption in that kitchen wasn't a spectacle, it was a pathway of expectation and sustained correction. The restaurant, now part of the fabric of the neighborhood, began to model a different set of assumptions. If there is a single sentence that condenses the arc, it is this: she built the table, and then she taught people how to come to it rightfully. That is not the same as revenge. It is craft. When the year turned and another round of invitations came for the restaurant's anniversary, Marcus walked in once more, this time to a round of applause that felt less like confirmation and more like community. He did not take the microphone. He moved to stand beside Tanya as she told the room plainly that the work of making a place of welcome is never finished. He put his hand on her shoulder as cameras flicked their lenses. The press would write what it pleased. The ledger would be checked and double-checked. But in the middle table where their family sat, there was a quiet, unshowy victory. If this inspired you, share this story and subscribe for more stories of reclaiming dignity.